Okay, so we're going to Esther chapter 7. You might remember last week we were talking Mordecai is hated by Haman. Haman was talking with his family and his friends, and they decided he's going to build a big gallows, and the next morning before the banquet, he's going to request to hang Mordecai. And when he gets there, the king tells him instead, he didn't even get a chance to say, hey, we should hang him. He said, you need to parade him around town and praise him because he's being honored by the king. And so he puts him on the horse in the king's robe, and he parades him around, and he goes home covering his head. He's pouting, which I don't blame him. He's a look at me kind of guy, but he has to show off the guy he hates. So that's where they were. And while he's at home crying about it, the eunuch shows up and says, hey, the banquet. Today's the banquet. Let's go. And so that's where we are, chapter 7, Esther chapter 7, verse 1. The banquet is about to start. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day, at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done. And remember, the king has already offered that before the first banquet. And so what I see Esther doing has a lot of wisdom to it, because when he first asked her what her request was, she said, come right now.
Sorry, what chapter are we in?
It's Esther chapter 7, and we're just read the first couple verses there. Sorry. So she puts, there's a banquet right then. Hey, the king and Haman, come, you're invited. They go and eat. King asks again, what is your request? And she tells him, I want another banquet tomorrow. So some of the wisdom there is that her request, when she finally gets to it, it's not a quick response. It's not a panicked response, a request that she wants. This is a thought out plan. And not to mention, now the king is listening. He is asked so many times, please tell me what you want. And so I think it shows some wisdom there. If you come right out with the request and it may or may not go well, remember Haman is the second-hand man. He's been promoted to be the best of the best. And so she's got the king on edge, like, just tell me what you want. And so they're at that banquet now. Verse 3, then Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue. Although the enemy could never compensate the king for the loss. To me, that sounds very calm. Your people and yourself could be destroyed, annihilated, she says, but she seems very calm. She's not in a panic. And I like the fact that she even mentions that this loss that the king would have, if all the Jews were gone, it would be such a great loss to the king. And again, you're in this mindset that the king is finally, he's ready, man, tell me. So he's listening to every detail of her request. And what we're going to see is the king seems like he didn't know that it was her people. I mean, he knew that a decree went out to all the provinces, we're going to destroy the Jews. But I don't think he put it together that it's Queen Esther's people and that she's a Jew. So let's see, verse 5. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And Esther said, the adversary and the enemy, is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen, which he should be. um, this is the first time you see any time that she says anything bad about Haman. And I thought that was interesting. It reminded me, Jesus washed the feet. He knew Judas was going to betray him. He knew who the betrayer was, and he washed his feet. Esther hasn't said anything bad about him. She's invited both of them to these banquets, and now finally, it's this wicked Haman. He's the one that's trying to destroy my people. And of course, it says that Haman was terrified. It made me think, I tried to picture, it doesn't tell us a lot of incidences where the king and queen are together and what their conversations were. We don't see a lot of that. But when we do see it, we see that the queen is very respectful because she uses phrases like, if it pleases the king, if I found favor. So it made me think that Haman, who's, I'm better than everybody, look at me, I'm a great guy, I'm the best. But it doesn't seem like he sees a place to put a wedge between the king and queen, the husband and wife. Like, if they're together on this, that he's wicked and needs to be stopped, if he could divide them, there could be a chance. But it doesn't seem like he sees that or feels that's an opportunity. And so I started thinking about this. He could have easily just said, hey, she's acting like Queen Vashti. We got to get rid of her, just like they did the queen earlier. But he doesn't, it's like that opportunity doesn't seem to be in front of him. Maybe it's just because he's terrified and he's not thinking straight. But it made me wonder, and I started thinking about some things about us. Like, what does it sound like? And I'm going to do both sides, so we'll start with the ladies. When the ladies are all together, what does it sound like when you talk about your spouse? Does it sound like somebody could jump in and drag him down too, just like you are? Or the guys, when you get together, what does it sound like when you talk about your spouse? Does it sound like there would be an opportunity to put a wedge and separate? Because Haman doesn't seem like there's an opportunity for that. And sometimes I think we can get caught up in it, where all the guys are together and we're just, my wife and whatever. And you could say some things you don't really mean, or maybe it's not as bad as you make it sound or whatever. But I wonder, we should stop and think, when we're with our coworkers, what does it sound like when we talk about our families or our spouse or this family? And, in Genesis 2:24, it says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to the wife, and they shall become one. So in our conversation, even if we're not together, it shouldn't be that we're dragging down our spouse. It shouldn't be anything that sounds negative, especially to a coworker, to the world. That would be, I just think that the concept of Christ in the church, that makes such a great view. And if the world could see you and your spouse and think Christ in the church, that's where we should be. And Haman's not seeing an opportunity to drive a wedge. We don't see a lot of the conversations between the king and the queen, but his kind of person, I would think that would be his strike. Let me just divide their thinking right now before it gets too bad. I want to share a story. It's a Home Depot story. And this happened a few years back, but we have a pro desk, and the guys and the girls that work up there, they just deal a lot with the contractors. But it was a really slow day. Nothing's going on, and I come walking up there, and there's 3 or 4 guys up there. I have no idea what their conversation was, but when I got there, the one guy, he looked at me and he said, what about you? What about your old lady? How would she feel? Well, I didn't hear the conversation, but my answer was, well, first of all, I didn't marry an old lady. And I remember Bob, he was just like, you defend your wife when she's not even here. And I just think, and don't make that sound like I'm some super husband, because I'm not. But in that moment, if I'm trying to reach out to people and I'm tearing down my own spouse, that just doesn't fit. It doesn't go well. And he just recognized it right away. You defend your spouse, she's not even here. And that made him think quite a bit. And so when I was going through this, I just couldn't help myself to think Haman should have took the shot and tried to split the husband and wife, the king and the queen, and he doesn't do it. There's a reason. And again, maybe it's just because he's terrified and he's not thinking straight. So I don't know if you guys have any comments on that concept.
Just the idea that the king is just announced to his wife, go ahead, make your request, I'll give you up to half my kingdom. That's a pretty big chunk to, for Haman to start shooting again.
That's
Haman's just realized his ship is going out.
That is true. If the king was willing to give, well, half the kingdom is yours, whatever you request, Haman may have felt like, okay, I'm done. There's a chance. It could be. Okay, so this next verse, it's going to kind of add into there, and I want to repeat it. It's Esther 7:7. I just think you could write this down, because if you haven't seen this happen, if you're married and you haven't seen this, you have a great marriage. Esther 7:7. Then the king, oh wait, first let me set it up. So she says, it's this wicked Haman. He's the one that wants to kill off my people. The king, verse 7, rose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. I can't help but think how many times there's your husband and wife, and there's a conversation that gets into more of an argument, that gets into more, maybe you're yelling. It's escalating. And all of a sudden, the man, he just gets up. He's got to leave. And he goes to the garage or his man cave or wherever he goes to get away from that conversation. And that's what I thought of, because it says he rose in his wrath and went to the garden. Now, he's not mad at his spouse or the queen, but the anger is so high. And I picture in a husband and wife, when those arguments start escalating, his beats per minute, his heart is really going. And his wrath, he's going into warrior mode. And he just has to get up and leave. He has to go. And I would just suggest don't follow him. He's going to calm down in his little man cave, in his little, whatever he goes to the garage, tinkers with tools or whatever he does. He is going to calm down. And what I think, and this is not my words, I heard this from somebody else, but I think that the wife misses, he doesn't say it out loud, he may not even think it, but he's saying, I love you and I don't want to hurt. I don't want to say something that'll hurt you. I don't want to do something that's going to hurt you. I need to get away. And it's just, when it came up here in the verse that the king in his wrath had to raise and run off, that's what I pictured. The husband and wife, there's always a time, as well as we get along, and then there'll be this argument. And the thing is, sometimes in that argument, for him, he heard something, well, a high percentage of chances you said something that was disrespectful and it just destroyed him inside. But other than that, he may have heard something that's true. Well, you're not a very good father. And he has to deal with that. And you keep talking, and he's trying to figure that out. Oh, you're not a very good husband. And if it sinks in and he knows it, he's struggling with that. And his beats are going up, and the wrath is there, and he's just got to leave. And the key is, we're going to see later, is the king came back. He went to the garden. He's not mad at his wife, by the way. His wrath is high, and he goes, he calms down and comes back, guys. That's the key. If you got to get out of the conversation, go. But calm down. That's your chance. Spend some time with the Lord. Talk about what your feelings are, what's going on in your head. Calm down and come back. And sometimes we're guilty of we're not coming back to that conversation. Especially if we've realized that we're failing at something. When we realize it, it's hard because we don't like to be failures. So anyways, I'm going to read verse 7 and continue on unless you have some comments about that, because I think everybody has seen some piece of that where the guy just gets up and leaves the conversation. So she says, it's this wicked Haman. Verse 7, the king rose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will you also assault the queen while I'm in the house?" There it is. So the king calmed down enough to come back and be rational. And when he steps in, I think this falls into, remember last week we had a whole list, it just happened. It just happened so, it just happened so. If you picture, like in our homes, usually the couch is against the wall because we have small homes. But this is a palace. I don't believe the couch was against the wall. Haman's pleading his case. He was around behind the edge of the couch. I believe he just fell. I don't think he was assaulting the queen. I think he fell. He just happened to fall right when the king was just happened to come in the door. But either way, he just calmed himself down and he comes in and Haman's acting a fool. Like I said, I really don't think he was trying to assault the queen. He's in a panic. He is pleading his case. His life is on the line. He fell. He lost his balance. But it's interesting because it says, the king, when he comes in, he says, "Will you also assault the queen when I am in the house?" And the very next line, as the words left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. It doesn't explain that very well, but I picture you no longer can even look at the queen. You have really messed this up bad. And they covered his face. And they're taking him out. But I think it's interesting to realize that the king calmed down enough to come back and deal with the situation. And then I think it just got bad right then. One of the things I didn't mention is when we run off from an argument or the king's wrath is so big he has to leave, I couldn't think of it, so I looked it up. But in 2 Corinthians 10:5, this may not match exactly, but some of it fits really good. It says, "Casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ." When you are so angry and the conversation is that bad, it's time to take those thoughts into captivity. They don't need to come out. Take those thoughts to captivity, calm down, talk with the Lord, tell him, this is how I feel. I don't know why. I do know why, maybe, whatever it is. But the king did that. He may not talk to the Lord, but he calmed himself down, came right back to a worse situation. And verse 9 cracks me up because it says, "Now Harbonah, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, 'Look, the gallows 50 cubits high, with which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman.' Then the king said, 'Hang him on it.' So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided." So first of all, remember, he built that gallows. It says, 50 cubits high. It's like 75 feet. That's way more than you need to hang somebody. Their feet aren't going to touch the ground. So I just picture that. It's another one of those just so happened to make it tall enough to see from the palace. And Haman's, "Ooh, look at me. Look what I'm doing. I'm doing great things." And he made that thing so big that the eunuch's like, "Look at that. That's right at Haman's place. He made that for Mordecai." It's like he's throwing gas on the fire. I don't suggest being the person that throws gas on the fire when somebody's angry, but I can see myself maybe doing that. And he really, like, there's the gallows. Haman made it for Mordecai, who the king just honored. He spoke good on your behalf, king. It just sounds to me like he's just gaslight. He's like, let me just throw some more gas on this fire because the king is really upset. And so Haman gets hung on his own gallows. which the whole thing with Haman and everything going opposite of what he expects. We've talked about it several times that God's not mentioned in this book. And yet, what we do see is those that raise themselves up and puff themselves up, God takes down. And those that are humble, he raises up. And also the fact that the Jews are in captivity and God is taking care of them. They're not going to be annihilated. That's what Haman's decree. As we sent this out to all the provinces, we want to annihilate them, put them to death. So Haman everything is just flipped over on him. It's a wreck. So maybe we should keep that in mind, not to get too proud and too, look at me, look at all the things that I do, it's great. And I'm the second young man, so I'm going to the banquet. I remember he was excited. He's telling his family, I'm going to the banquet. Well, turned out not too good. Any comments, questions? Because we're going to take a look at this fact there. Esther and Mordecai were humble, and the Lord lifted them up. They were humble the whole time. Remember, Mordecai is at the gate. He can't even come in. He's a nobody. He sits at the gate, even though he was just paraded around town. Look at this guy we're honoring because he helped the king. When he got done, he went back to the gate. He's humble. He's nobody. He's only really hanging out at the gate because he wants to know that Esther's okay. And Haman, after he paraded him around, he covered his head, which is really opposite for him because he's usually, look at me, but he didn't want everybody looking now because I just honored the guy that everybody knows he hates. And, Matthew 23:12, it says, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. And we see it in action right there. Esther and Mordecai are being exalted. We're going to go on and see how much more they're exalted. And Haman, who didn't humble himself, he is humbled now. Well, now he's been hanged, which is not a good thing.
I'm thinking about, you said that Esther was respectful to the king. I think she was. Thinking about Haman, I think he was like a man pleaser. I think, he tried to, I can't think of a polite term, but he tried to buddy up with the king, but he didn't really have any respect for him as such. I think.
Right.
He would say sir and stuff, but he didn't really mean it.
Right. In case you couldn't hear, Esther was very respectful and very, if it pleases the king, if I found favor. But Haman, he may have said sir and gave the right terms, but he didn't have it in his heart to respect the king. He was just all about himself, and he'd say the right things. Well, that kind of stuff, I think you can see it pretty easily. And but he still got promoted. He did his thing, but he wasn't honoring the king. He wasn't honoring the queen. People should bow down to me. That's why Mordecai was in bad shape, because he wouldn't bow down. And so, yeah, that's a big contrast from saying the right things and trying to do the things, but actually meaning it. If you don't mean it, it really has no weight to it. It might sound good for a while, but people will see it. You don't really mean it. We're called throughout the scriptures to encourage one another. And if we're encouraging, but we don't really mean it, it'll come out. You're just doing the thing, and it doesn't honor our king at all. God will be looking down like, your words, you're just saying words, but you're not trying to encourage one another. So we want to be sure that our words actually have weight to them. They're coming from the heart. We actually doing what we need to do. Anything else? So we're going to start chapter 8. I had to divide the chapters because chapter 10 is like one paragraph. And so I started looking at it and I was like, well, we're going to make it work. Chapter 8, we'll just have a few more minutes, but let's see. It says on that day, King Ahasuerus, however you say it, gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. So there that is. There's that honoring, being exalted. You humble yourself and you're exalted, which we already talked about. So verse 3, Esther chapter 8, verse 3. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite, the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out his golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, I lost my line there. If I found favor in the king and in his sight, the things seem right to the king, I am pleased in his eyes. Let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews, who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? And how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? There it is again. So just hanging Haman didn't stop those letters went out with the king's signet. They're going to destroy they have a date set, and it's coming. They're going to destroy the Jews. So Esther goes before him, and as you might remember in in chapter 4, if you went before the king and you weren't invited, you were dead. That was death. You were just going to die unless he held the scepter out. Well, you see that happens in chapter 4. He held that golden scepter out to her. She came unannounced again. But you see her, I'm just going to reread some of those things. She fell down at his feet. That's giving huge honor. You bow down to their feet. If it pleases the king, if I found favor, if I'm pleasing in his eyes, those are her terms, because they've already solved Haman himself, but they haven't solved that whole annihilation of their people. And again, she's giving honor to the king. She's coming in with the idea that you don't owe me anything. I'm just the queen. I mean, you think, well, that's secondhand man, right? But she's not putting that out like, hey, I'm the queen here. We're going to make this happen. She's still pleading with the king. And she does mention the evil plan of Haman, but she doesn't really degrade him. I think it's interesting that she used earlier, she said that wicked Haman, but you could come in and just slander him. Now he's dead. There's no need to, but doesn't seem to be her way of talking. And I was looking at this and I was thinking of her plead. And again, like if you're the queen, I mean, you're right up there in the ranks. I don't know. But today's world, we're out here, it seems like we talk like, you owe me. You owe this to me. I deserve this. That's how we talk in our society anyway. Hopefully not us, but that's the kind of thing that you see today is when people talk like everything, they deserve everything. And she doesn't come in there with that attitude. Like, I don't deserve this, but we should fix it. And she's very respectful. No comments. We're doing pretty good. Esther chapter 8, verse 7. Then the king Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hands on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews, as you please. in the king's name and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. And it's interesting because he's not revoking what was already sent out, but he is offering to those two, write whatever you want, and then use my ring, seal it, and nobody can stop it. And it's interesting because all the provinces have a date where they can kill the Jews and plunder them. That decree's out there, and the king doesn't say, well, hey, shut that down. But he does say, whatever you write, seal it with my ring, and it's good. And it reminds me, if you remember in the first few chapters, I was talking about this king seems to be easily persuaded, very easily persuaded. Remember, I think he was persuaded to show off his wife. And then when she didn't come, he was persuaded to put her away. Let's get rid of her. Then he was persuaded to take all the virgins from all the provinces to find another wife. The persuasion to just give the signet ring to Haman, we promoted him to the right-hand man, and he's there, whatever you want to write. I don't think he realized that you're talking about killing off all the Jews. He certainly didn't put it together that it was Esther was part of that. It just seems like that king is just, he's easily persuaded, and he doesn't, it's not like he's making the rule. Like, okay, well, we're not going to kill the Jews, so let me put it in my words as how it goes. He just says, whatever you two feel. It doesn't sound to me like great leadership, and yet God takes control of that leadership and saves his people, and we'll see. But that concept is just write another decree, put my signature on it.
Well, the other reason that he can't just stop the other laws is because, according to the Medes and the Persians, they couldn't change a law that was put in place. Remember with Daniel in the lion's den, once it was determined that whoever did not bow down had to be thrown into the lion's den. So King Darius, he was like, well, the law is set, even though now I find out it's Daniel who's going to suffer, I can't change it. He's like, even though I'm the king, I can't change that. And so that's why he was upset, but pleaded, prayed to your God, and then the next day, once he had survived the lion's den, now he changed, and had that change, but he couldn't change it. So once this decree was made, he can't just revoke it. It was like, once it's done according to the Medes and the Persians, and so that's why it's so challenging that he's going to say, well, I can't change that law, but I can add another law to this. And so you can defend yourself, which could get into maybe a discussion next time on, I believe this is a principle for Christians, that you do have the right to defend yourself. That you don't, it's not that you just lay down and let somebody walk all over you, but they are allowed to defend themselves from evil.
Right, which is next. We'll get into this new decree that's going to go out and what it actually says. But it's, so Mordecai went from the gate. Now he's in charge of Haman's household, the house they gave to Esther, and he has the signet ring. And the king is like, whatever you write in there, just seal it with my ring and it's good. And then that decree is going to go out. And it just, I think one of the overall pictures is this is chapter 8. There's 10 chapters in this book. God's never mentioned, but we see it clearly how God is protecting his people, even though they're in captivity because they weren't listening to God. Otherwise, you're not in captivity. You're in God's hands at his holy land. But they're in captivity, but God still takes care of his people. And especially when you see how humble Mordecai is and how humble Esther is, those are the kinds of people that God says, those are my children right there. I'm taking care of them. And he doesn't bring some hailstones down and destroy those that are trying to hurt his people. He doesn't open up the earth. We saw that before earlier and swallow up people. but he's just so happens, we talked about that whole list. We'll do that list again, but it just so happens, and God just takes care of each of these little things to make the whole thing work good. And sometimes we'll overlook those just so happens, and we think, man, is God working in our lives today? Is he helping Salt River? Is he doing anything for us? Well, that's why we're called to count our blessings, right? You're going to rehash and relook and say, oh, yeah, God is taking care of that. God is taking care of that. Look at my life. It's not as miserable as like I would like to think. And God is taking care of things, and it doesn't mean that it's some big miraculous thing. It just means he's there. He's taking care of it. He's not even mentioned in this book, but we see it pretty plainly. So next week, we're going to see what the new decree is and how Mordecai uses that signet ring. Because, wow, that's a lot of power. Like, oh, I've got the ring. So we're going to see how he does that as a humble person. And unless you have some other comments, I am done. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we just praise you and thank you for all that you do for us. We praise you that you take care of us. Sometimes we don't see it. Sometimes we're not paying attention. Help us to remember to look back and to be thankful for what you have done. Help us to stay in your word and to search for that truth and to see what you are doing with your people, how you take care of us, how you love us. Especially that we be thankful for your Son, because without him we couldn't even come to you. We just praise you and thank you for that sacrifice. In Christ's name, amen.